Hello and welcome to The Darkside. I am your host, Tabitha Purple, and Mr. Storm will be joining very shortly as co-host. We are delighted that you choose to spend your time with us, whether that's live or in playback. We appreciate all of those who watch in playback. Thank you so much. Please continue to like and share if you find our content good. Help us with new topics. Well, this week has had a lot of news stories, and so I think we'll just jump straight into the news this week. There are three news stories that I particularly wanted to touch on before Mr. Storm gets on with his stories, and then we get into our main topic, which is the dark side of nations. Now, if you're an avid follower of us, you will know that Mr. Storm has been talking about this or hinting at this for some time, and so it'll be interesting to see what he has in mind today. I'm sure it will make us all think a lot about our allegiances and what we're doing. All right, so for now, three news stories from me. So the first news story is one that broke today, which, or at least broke today in this part of the world, I should say, which is to say that the Mohammed Jafar Montazeri, who is the Attorney General in Iran, has made a statement, or has alluded to making statements, that basically Iran's morality police have been disbanded and it's no more. And so there's an interesting discussion happening, or at least at the beginning stages of happening, of what does it mean if the police are disbanded. And obviously we know that this has come about because there have been protests for more than 70 days now, where they've been protesting. Women have been going out every day, burning hijabs, letting it be known that this morality police will not be tolerated. And this is because 22-year-old Amini died in custody on the 16th of September. And so there's been some discussion about whether this is a turning point for the protests, whether it's going to be a turning point for the country. But the reality is this isn't confirmed. And so the statements themselves are ambiguous, to say the least. And so we we're looking at that. Hey, Outhouse Ministries, how you doing? But yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think it gives pause for thought. Of course, the women there have been committed to the cause alongside all of their allies. They've been jumping on this. The truth of the matter is, though, is this real, and does it actually bring about change if the laws that the morality priests are actually enforcing are still in place? And so this would only be a first step towards what would be ultimately what the women are saying they want, which is the removal of these laws. Hijab should not be mandatory. And that is their statements. Mr. Storm, do you have anything you want to add to that news story?
I think this was to be expected, considering everything that was going on over there. I've always said that when a people have enough of their government, well, we've seen historically what will happen. And considering the way that the current regime came to power in that country, I think what they're looking at is that if they don't do something to relieve the pressure, it'll be them with their heads on the chopping block this time around. So considering that the protest was not showing any signs of dying down and was on the verge of turning into a full-blown revolution, that was their only option, to relent and give in to some demands, or start to concede some demands. I am skeptical about whether it will bring about wholesale change within the country. But don't worry, there's a CIA for that.
Okay, which brings us on to another country then, I think, on that comment, which is El Salvador. So many people will follow the news in South America and will be very much aware of the situation in El Salvador, some of the political problems that have been happening there over the years, the fact that en masse there were deportations to El Salvador of criminals, which has bolstered their criminal network, which has created so many problems. And of course, then there are people who are fleeing the country due to the criminal activities and the bloodshed and the violence that happens. So they have a prime minister, a president, I should say. El Salvador's president is Nayib Bukele. I hope I've said that right. I apologize if I haven't. And basically, he has decided on a crackdown on the country's street gangs, and which basically has seen 57,000 people arrested on suspicion of gang affiliation since March. I mean, that is an incredible number of people. The article that I'm reading is from the BBC website, and it's from a correspondent based in South America. And what is interesting about it is the focus of the article is that there are, if you arrest 57,000 people, there will be people caught up in that who are not gang members. And this is a huge injustice and a huge problem, because you're doing human rights atrocities, so to speak. And so this was the point of the article. I found that quite interesting, because this has been going on since March. This article is literally been released 18 hours ago. So since March, this president has been clamping down on street gangs. He's been empowering the police, empowering the military to go in. And this is off the back of a spate of killings that killed 70 people in I think it was a week or less than a month, basically. And he said, that's it, we're putting in, what do they call that thing? When they, help me, Mr. Storm, what's that thing? When they go in with the military power, they put in, and then they're just scooping everyone up.
Martial law.
Martial law, thank you. And so that's the situation. What I found really a bit frustrating is that the article is written in such a way that it lends itself to people protesting this president's actions in his country, and saying, okay, what he's doing is a human rights violation. This is really wrong, and he shouldn't be doing that. And whether that is true or not, I don't know. I don't know enough about this president's actions since March to actually be able to make an informed decision on that. I'm not El Salvadorian, so I wouldn't actually know some of the nuances of that conversation. And by all accounts of what's being said, the streets the cities have become such more peaceful places than they've ever been. People have actually been able to walk around without the fear of violence and the threat of violence upon them. So it's a double-edged sword, right? What's a bit rich is the USA and the UK and places like that will talk about the human rights violations of this gentleman, about how people are unfairly arrested. And all I would have to say is, look at your own country first. Shall we deal with that? Before going in and telling people that they're violating human rights. And the reason I say that is not because the people are not violating human rights, is that because often when these Western European countries say that, what follows next is a set of sanctions upon the country in which it strangleholds the people even further. Oh, because you're doing these human rights violations, under this reason, we are going to put sanctions on you. And we've seen this time and time again in other countries. So it worries me that already the article is beginning to lay that groundwork. You know, I haven't seen many articles before now talking about how this president has been doing this action to clamp down on the gang violence that has been ripping through his country, that has been destroying lives, and that has been causing people to flee to neighboring countries. We haven't seen, you know, the kind of positive praise for that kind of action. We haven't seen the assessments of that. But immediately that, you know, some news stories that come through, and I'm not saying that the people who are at the center of these stories are false or that it isn't a human rights violation or what have you. It's just, it's interesting to me that up until now we've had silence. And now all of a sudden, when it's a human rights issue and you have the opportunity then to come in from a different angle and then tell the people here, yo, hey, we're going to clamp down on you and this is what we're going to do. And we've seen it repeated before, where they begin to then stranglehold the country. We've seen it in other places, including El Salvador, where they begin to put sanctions on and make it almost impossible for the people to live on the ground. So for me, this was a difficult story, because I had such empathy for the stories I was reading of the personal pain of those individuals who are swept up in the 57,000 who are not criminal, And at the same time, it gave me such chills to read an article written with obvious overtones and obvious agenda to kind of push this in a way to say, hey, this country has been suffering for years under this. Now somebody's doing something. And whether it's appropriate or inappropriate or whatever you may say, we've not done anything to support them. But what we are going to do is come in and jump on this agenda so that we can push something else, which is often the crippling of lesser nations. That's how I read it. Mr. Storm, any thoughts? I don't know if you knew about the El Salvador case or not.
I actually don't know about the El Salvador news story. With that said, I would say look for who's losing money in this. And I say that based on the story of the US involvement in Guatemala and what they did to overthrow the first democratically elected governments there. Yeah, I'm sure there are people who are innocent that are caught up in the arrest in Guatemala. And they're absolutely right that they are being abused. But I agree with you in the hypocrisy of Western nations talking about falsely arresting people. The US arrests 10 million people a year as of 2019. That's one person every 3 seconds, pretty much, right? So coming in there and taking the viewpoint that you're infringing on somebody's rights, I'd like to know how many millions of people have had the rights trampled on by the US. And often it's not actually done with the aim of making a country safer. And one of the things that has stuck out this week, where people have talked about the World Cup in Qatar, I've listened to the accounts of female football fans who have said this is the first time they have been to a major tournament and not been harassed, not been catcalled, felt free and safe to walk down the streets without fear of abuse or sexual intimidation or violence or anything like this. And so what I'm listening to is actually people who have a real interest in the safety and security of their country. Now, we might disagree with their methods and how they go about it, but actually they're trying to bring about safety and improve the life of the majority of their population. Considering the fact that Western nations actually don't care about the majority of their population and aren't doing things to improve the lots of their population, I don't really have time for their input on these things. And what we said about sanctions, or what you were saying about sanctions, it goes back to what I said about Iran. When people have had enough of their government, they'll get rid of them. And the whole point of sanctions isn't actually to hurt people at the top, it's to hurt people at the bottom, so that they will then turn to revolution as a way to remove the government that one of these Western nations, ex-colonial powers, are not in favor of.
Yeah. As I said, for me, it's quite worrying. It's quite, it leaves a bad taste in the mouth in that way. And I'm just going to keep an eye on this situation. I don't know very many El Salvadorians, I don't think, but I recognize the pattern and the trend, and I think it's important that we look at that, and we keep our eyes and ears open to how the manipulation of media and output comes, especially with the backdrop of some of the conversations about border walls in the USA. I think, I have questions. I have questions about this particular story, so I'll just keep reading on it. So that's what I'll do.
In many ways, it looks like the same story they put out about Kagame in Rwanda. And they said human rights abuses, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't doubt for a second that there were some along the way. But
Mm,
actually, it's one of the safest countries in the world right now. And the biggest reason that they turned around and said, "Hey, there's human rights abuses going on," wasn't actually because of human rights abuses. It was because Kagame gave a middle finger to the US in particular in regards to the export of secondhand clothing, because
ah,
that's a
I remember this.
billion-dollar industry,
Yes, yes,
right?
yes.
And what Kagame said was, no, this is hurting our own local textile industries. And
Yes.
we need to support our own people in
Mhm.
being able to make a living. And he banned the import of secondhand clothing.
Yeah.
And of course, that boosted the local economy, but
Mm,
took billions out of the pockets of those in the US. And
mhm,
that was when the US turned around and said, hey, there's human rights abuses going on in your country. They turned a blind eye to everything before that.
mhm.
So, yes, there are people that are being hurt along the way, but there are also people whose lives are being improved by this. And you have to ask yourself, what actually is the overall intention of the policy at hand?
Yeah.
And that's not to say that the ends justify the means, but I think it's more to say, before you go about demonizing someone,
Mm, 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 mm.
let's see if they're sincere in what their actual aims are and what their actual goals are.
Yeah.
Because I can talk about a lot of policies that on the surface Western governments will say is good, but actually when you dig deeper, it's
Mhm.
actually harming the people,
Definitely.
and they know it's harming the people. And look, just the most obvious one, Brexit.
Harm the people.
Harm the people. Everybody said it was going to harm the people. All the financial experts said it would be harmful. Nearly everybody said it would be harmful, but
It's been
they still
harmful,
pushed it with it,
and they still pushed it through.
right?
Yeah, I think this is my concern, is that, or my addition to what you're saying is, not only look at the intention, of course, but once you've looked at the intention, doesn't that change how you approach the subject? So if you look at somebody and you say, hey, your intentions are good, but your methodology is incorrect, that's a different statement, right? Your intention is great. Methodology needs work. Here, let us help you to figure out a better methodology of achieving your goal that doesn't infringe on the rights of average citizens, who are going about their local business, and who are trying their best to live in amongst the threat of violence that plagues their cities. Like, that's a different conversation too. You're acting in a way that breaks human rights convention, and therefore we should have to sanction you. Well, that doesn't actually speak to the problem that the president is having, or that the people are having in their country. And one of the lines that really caught me is, the El Salvadorian, some people that got caught up, one of the stories they reported is because ex-gang members, people who had renounced their gang membership decades before, were being picked up as well. And so people saying that's unfair. These people have tried to live, outside of the gang system. It's not fair that you're now coming to penalize them. And so my point again would be, absolutely, it's not fair that people who have tried to reform and try to go on a journey to doing better are being caught up in this. So the question would be to the government, what can you do better to serve all of your people, not just to try and target this one goal and then blanket 57,000 people, when maybe it's not that many people who are in the criminal activities, and maybe you need a different approach. That's a really different question than let's just penalize them, which is how the article sounded. As I read, I was like, I'm a bit uncomfortable with this. I feel the overtones, and I think that speaks to your point, Mr. Storm, about intention. I think maybe. Anyway, next story is a popular one. I've had quite a few messages asking if we're going to cover this story this week, and so here it is. I'd like to read you a transcript from an 80-something-year-old lady and a nearly 60-year-old lady. The question is this. The 80-year-old lady says to the 60-year-old lady, "Where are you from?" And she responds, sister space. No, where do you come from? And so she says, well, we're based in Hackney. No, what part of Africa are you from? I don't know. They didn't leave any records. Well, you must know where you're from. I spent time in France. Where are you from? Here in the UK. No, but what nationality are you? I'm born here and I'm British. No, but where do you really come from? Where do your people come from? My people, lady, what is this? Oh, I can see I'm going to have a challenge getting you to say where you're from. When did you first come here? Lady, I'm a British national. My parents came here in the 50s when, oh, I know we'd get there in the end. You're Caribbean. No, lady. I am of African heritage, Caribbean descent, and British nationality. Oh, so you're from... This is the conversation that happened between Lady Suzanne Hussey and Ngozi Fulani. It is a conversation between a lady in waiting for the Queen, for the former Queen, who is the godparent of the Prince William, and also between the charity founder for Sister Space, who is a charity based in Hackney, and I'm sure they could do with your support. They do great work down there. This was at an event that was actually meant to be raising awareness about what was it now? Violence against women, I believe, was the actual event. And so this was an event that was happening in which people should have been focused on talking about violence against women, and everybody that was invited was within that community and were all providing services. The lady in question has stepped down, and there have been many conversations about whether this was racism. Is it racist? Is it not racist? There's been conversations about whether she should have stepped down. Did the young lady in question just not understand her? Was it a misunderstanding? And so I think I want to just bring in a couple of points, because I think Mr. Storm's going to just tidy this all up nicely for us. There's a couple of points. This young lady is nearly 60. And so when you talk about generational issues, I would care for you to speak about her with respect, please. I find it really disrespectful that people put her in the category of a 20-year-old when she is quite clearly a woman who is running a charity and doing her work. And so let's make sure we get that straight. This is not a generational issue in terms of, well, old people. Okay, this is an older woman speaking to an older woman, and there should have been some common understanding. That's my first point to make about that. My second point to make about that is that what makes me really frustrated with the conversation is people are like, oh, but she's old. Okay, but she's educated on protocols. She is educated enough to have traveled. She's educated enough to have had more than one conversation. She would have royal protocols. She would have all sorts of information at hand to which she would have been educated to a level at which she does not need to make these kinds of questions and statements. She was given every single opportunity not to go down that road, and she persistently went down there, knowing that she was being offensive, knowing that it was causing harm, not doing it to anyone else. And it was, in fact, other people who were witnessing it, who were flagging this up, saying, okay, this isn't right. Miss Fulani should not have to be dealing with this type of interrogation at an event in which women's issues are being at the forefront, and we're actually here to discuss things like violence against women. So that shouldn't have been that. There is another issue, which is the fact that she does it knowingly. So the idea that she doesn't do it knowingly is ridiculous. She's asked what nationality the woman is, and the woman replies she's a British person. From there, your conversation ends. If you were asking with any interest, care, attention, there are a million different questions you would have asked this woman. Instead of persisting to other her, you continued down a line of question which would have excluded her from conversation. You are making it very clear you were not interested in the woman at all. You weren't interested in her charity. You weren't interested in the work she does. You weren't interested in her name or where it originates from because it's unusual or you hadn't heard it before. You weren't interested even in her story. When she says something as painful as, "There were not records, madam," you already know that she is a descendant of people whose identity have been stripped from them, but you persist anyway because you believe you have a right to other and be discriminatory. And for me, that is just the height of hypocrisy to then turn around and say, "Oh, but she's old. Maybe she doesn't know," or "it's a faux pas," which I heard one news reporter say, which almost made me jump in the TV and start there and then the Darkside episode and say to him, "No, it's not a faux pas. This was an intentional action, and she thought she was going to get away with it. And that is why." And her stepping down at 80-something years old makes what difference to who? Where is the actual accountability for the institution who clearly does not hold its staff to any kind of protocol that they believe is so important that we've had incidents where Marians have told us they can't open curtains because of protocol. They can't talk openly because of protocol. They can't raise their voice because of protocol. But you can answer, you can you can ask these questions because of protocol. And let's not even forget, this is all being done to the backdrop of accusations that the institution is already racist, with you denying any knowledge of the fact that it's racist while clearly demonstrating the same thing. I find it frustrating to hear the conversation by respected journalists who were reporting on this like, "Oh, I think my grandma made a mistake." This isn't your grandmother. This is a woman who is educated and who had access to protocols and who knew better and took a deliberate course of action that harmed someone else and embarrassed her in front of a room full of people. No, absolutely not. Anyway, Mr. Storm, I'm sure you have something else to say.
Yeah, I got plenty to say on this one. Let's see. All right, where to begin? Yeah, that's pretty much my response. Yeah, that is pretty much my response on this. Look, um, first of all, we need to start off with the fact that this was a invitation to deal with for people who were addressing the issue of abuse against women and violence against women. And along comes someone who feels so entitled over the body of a woman that she would touch a stranger in a way that would make that stranger uncomfortable. There's a real delicious irony in this.
Mm-hmm.
You invite people who are victims or women who are victims of abuse or supporting victims of abuse to an event only to then abuse them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, people might say, hey, it's not a big thing. All she did was move her hair. I'm sorry. Let me walk up to a white woman on the train and just move her hair and then watch hell break loose. Right?
I mean, like for like, let's just walk up to in an event and start talking to someone and go, "Let me just move your hair out of your face." Mind you, I've had people do that to me and it drives me insane. Don't touch my hair, huh?
Right? But there's a sense of entitlement that's taking place. Now, I hear people say, hey, she's an old woman. I'm sorry, what is the age at which it is acceptable to be racist?
Mm. Yeah.
Is
I
it
saw
40? Is it 50? Is
Mhm.
it 60? What is the age?
Well, according to people, it's any age because when they're young, they're inexperienced and they didn't know better. When they're old, they're ignorant and they lived in different times. And when they're in the middle, well, they didn't mean it. They were just, okay, insert whatever excuse you would like in the Middle Ages.
Right?
So every
Now,
age is an age.
now here's the thing. it can be acceptable to say to somebody, "Where are you from?" Right? But this is dependent on context.
Mm,
And the context is that the conversation is a sincere, genuine conversation with an interest, a
mm,
mutual interest in each other,
mm,
right? To reach a better understanding
mm,
of each other and to find commonality. And where you see that that isn't the case in this story is that, first of all, this entitled lady receives an answer to her question, which she refuses to accept,
mhm,
right? So the interrogation shows, hey, there's actually no real mutual understanding or exchange taking place here.
mhm,
And the second point in which you see it is in the elation that she takes, the pure joy she takes when she says, I knew we would get there. When she hears Miss
Falani.
El- her first name's Ngozi,
Rosie
yes?
Falani. Yeah.
Right. When she hears her say, um, oh, yes, my parents are from or
Yeah.
came,
I am of
you know,
African heritage, Caribbean descent, and
right.
British nationality.
And that when she feels a sense of joy and elation and vindication when she hears something that says, no, I'm not from here,
Mm,
which shows that the whole purpose of her conversation was to elicit from this woman a statement that she did not belong in that space.
mm,
So anybody who tries to dress this up as anything other than racist,
mm, mm.
well, you might want to check your own racism levels.
Yeah. And I will caveat that to say, having had conversations with people from other ethnic minorities or ethnic world majority nations. There you go, much better description. Sorry, my apologies. Um, one of the things that we all have in common is that we're frequently, if you're in a European country, asked, where are you from? And some people express, well, I've been asked that. I don't find it offensive. And there are nuances, as you said earlier, to this conversation. It isn't just so black and white. You've stated that there are times when people ask you, where are you from? And there's a genuine mutual conversation. And oftentimes that mutual conversation is because the respect that they have for different minority different world majority peoples is actually on display when they're having that conversation. And that's maybe something you've never felt uncomfortable with because you're not on the receiving end of a conversation which clearly was meant to other you. If you had any interest in this woman, once she said sister space, the next logical question would have been, what is sister space? If you then still wanted to find out where it was based or something more about her, and you asked again, and then she said Hackney, that's I know that area, that's in London, da, 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 da. You would have asked questions pertaining to the answers you were getting. And in most cases, that isn't what happens. And so there are nuances to this conversation based on age, based on ethnicity, and as you said, there are times when asking the question is mutual. It's done out of respect for the person's identity, culture, just a general interest in the person, whereas this clearly wasn't the case. And you can't make it be something it clearly wasn't. It clearly was not that. She had no interest in this woman at all. She didn't ask any questions about any of the other stuff this woman did, only about her race, and her relation was clear. Makes me upset. Tabitha's gonna stop because it bothers her. The whole question bothers her. Anyway. All right, should we get to our main topic, or do you have some news stories you want to cover this evening?
Do you know I have a lot of news stories that have been going on this week, and I can't really remember all of them. Um, One that I do want to mention actually is the looming trade war between the EU and Ghana and the Ivory Coast.
Oh, you told me about this story. This is
Right.
interesting.
So anybody who is interested in chocolate, I suggest you stock up now before the prices go through the roof. And so what's currently happening is the EU are looking to put sanctions on the Ivory Coast and Ghana. Now, the Ivory Coast and Ghana account for 60% of the world's cocoa production. And the EU went to these countries and said, hey, your cocoa isn't sustainable cocoa. We can't say it's free from child labor. We can't say you're paying your people fairly. So we're going to impose sanctions on you. And one of the other things that they said was, it's not economically friendly, so ecologically friendly. So we're going to have to place sanctions on you. But to avoid the sanctions, you can buy some carbon credits from us. In other words, pay us not to place sanctions upon you. And Ghana's president a few years, because it first started a few years back, but now it's really coming to a head. And Ghana's president said, you know what? Okay, we grow the cocoa here, but it's taken out of the country. It's refined out of country, and all the value is added out of country. We are going to invest in our infrastructure, and I can't remember if it was 30% or 60%. He set a target would be refined in country, so the value would be added in country, and then the European nations would have to buy the cocoa from them, the refined cocoa from them. Now, everybody laughed when he said this because Ghana lacked the infrastructure to do this. But he put in place mechanisms where there was heavy investment in this. And now they are doing this. And now they are manufacturing their own chocolate bar. So anybody from Ghana who watches this, I would really be interested in trying some of that chocolate. So, feel free to send me a bar or box of bars. I'm not opposed to that idea either. But yeah, so this is a interesting story to watch because there's some convention, chocolate convention that takes place in Europe, and Ivory Coast and Ghana have boycotted this one this year. But they also formed a trading bloc based on the model of OPEC. So
explain to the people, because maybe not everyone got that straight away.
So this is the oil producing something countries, but basically they regulate the market prices of oil, and the way they do that is that they determine how much of it they're going to manufacture and produce. So the Ivory Coast and Ghana have set up a model in this in which they're able to influence the price of cocoa by determining how much their nations are going to produce. And since they already account for 60% between the two countries, they're in a position to do it. Right?
All they need is Nigeria and what's the other country now? Cameroon to join. And they've got the whole market covered.
Pretty much. I mean, you have smaller markets that produce like Trinidad and things like that.
Tiny comparatively. Sorry.
Yes, as I said, they're tiny by comparison, but this is going to force the price of cocoa, so chocolate and chocolate-based products, through the roof.
Are going to be
right. So this is going to have to be resolved real quick, and it's either going to be resolved by Europe having to back down, or what you're going to see is they're going to try and destabilize the governments in these countries.
Watch this space, people. Watch this space.
We'll see what happens.
Let's hope they back down, huh? Let's hope they back down.
So that was one of the stories of this week. The update on
the case. Yes.
Yes.
So last week we covered the case of Cuella, a young woman who was murdered in Mexico when she went on holiday with her friends. And you have the update. I haven't managed to catch up with the update of that because I was busy with other stories.
Yeah. Basically, the Mexican authorities are looking to extradite one of her so-called friends on charges or investigation of murder. Yeah. I think normally I would be very skeptical about the chances of this happening. I'm not so skeptical about this in this case because the way the legal system in the US is set up, it's very difficult to achieve, but it is achievable, is that a crime committed by a US citizen of murder abroad, they can extradite, or the FBI can investigate, and then charges can be brought by the FBI, especially where it's a case of a US citizen who is the victim and another US citizen who's the perpetrator. So I think there will probably be movement on this case, whether she's extradited to Mexico for charges, or whether the federal government of the US will bring charges within the US. But I think we're going to see movement on this fairly soon. And it seems that they've identified who this person is. But it's also unknown, but it's suspected that the Mexican authorities are probably going to bring charges against the rest of the friends too, not just the person that attacked. So we'll see what happens. But as it stands, the FBI is apparently liaising and supporting the Mexican authorities in the investigation of this. Yeah, watch this space.
Yeah, we will keep watching this space, I think. Yeah, as I said, from the time I read the story, my heart broke. I just couldn't imagine, could not imagine what the parents are going through, and their heartbreak was obvious. And yeah, so we keep praying for their healing.
All I gotta say is, in a hypothetical situation, if that had happened to my child, listen, I'm gonna find these friends. I'm gonna put them in the boot of a car, drive them down to Mexico.
Do you realize this is being live streamed, huh?
And deposit them outside the police station.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I said, look, this is hypothetically.
That's okay. Just so everyone knows, he said hypothetical. And this is, yeah, okay. Anyway, let's get on to our main story for today before we get into any more trouble. Main story for today is the dark side of nations. This is your baby, your topic. We first had this conversation, I think, pre-pandemic, if I'm not mistaken, where we were having a discussion about border control. And I was frustrated, probably about Brexit and the way that the flow of people in and out of the country was being reported. And you said, I don't believe in the idea of nations anyway. And I went, huh? What do you mean? We've had nations forever. What could you possibly mean? And so tell us, what is the dark side of nations?
Oh, what's a good side? That's a genuine question. What's a positive that you can tell me about nations?
I guess a sense of belonging, a way to organize services, amenities, a way to organize people and movement of people. So obviously we have transportation networks that happen with it that need to be organized. You have hospitals. If we all just lived in little tiny villages or dots or what have you, then it would be more difficult to have the specialization or access to care. I guess in the case like we just read in Quella's case, if a crime is committed in a jurisdiction, you can appeal to the services of another jurisdiction, which may have better equipment, I don't know, stuff like that, and work together. So yeah, I guess.
Really? Because it seems to me as though it's the nation that's actually preventing justice in the case of Quella, because you need to try and get it extradited.
Well, yeah, I mean, understandable, but in this case, it seems to be working. The system seems to be working well. In other cases, yes, there have been problems with the whole extradition processes, and the US has a notorious policy of not extraditing its people, full stop, and so that can be problematic. But I mean, USA aside, and that particular issue, yeah, I don't. This isn't my. You do the dark side. I'm not here to sell a
No,
nation.
no,
You tell me
I'm
how you're
simply asking,
nation.
do you have
No, you
any
do your work.
positives of it? Look, I think first of all, I think the concept of nations and nation states,
Mm-hmm.
specifically nation states, because you could have a nation as a group of people with a common identity,
Mm-hmm.
but that nation state need is different because the state then has a concept of ownership of land, of resources. And I think my biggest issues with the concept of nations and nation states is that one, it feeds into the idea of capitalism and ownership, and two, it very much is one of the underpinning foundations for fascism.
Okay, go ahead.
Well,
What?
it's one of the characteristics of fascism is a strong national identity, and also it's very close, or it. I think it's possible to be xenophobic without nations. You can be xenophobic in regards to cultural lines,
Okay,
but the idea of a nation state very much supports and underpins and encourages xenophobia,
okay.
right? Um, so these are some of the reasons that or some of the, well, surface reasons of why I'm not a big fan of nations.
Okay.
Because when you dig deeper into this concept, well, what is the point of nations as we have them now? Right? So, for example, nations as we have them now and as they are demarked and delineated are not natural boundaries.
Mm. Well, are not natural boundaries outside of Europe, you mean?
No, I mean even within Europe.
Okay.
For example, take Spain and the Catalonians who want
Okay.
independence,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
right? So how we have them now, they're not actually um, natural boundaries and divisions of people. So
Mm-hmm.
when we say, look, you're a nation, what is it that holds you together as a nation?
I'm now starting to question my whole life.
Because if we say it's a cultural identity,
Mm.
well, then the Catalonians would say, well, actually, we're actually very different to the Madristas
Mm-hmm.
and the Basque.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, you take it to Nigeria, and Africa's a whole different kettle of fish because we're now talking about the Council of Berlin, in which European countries said, hey, I want this piece, I want that piece, you can have this piece, and then we don't have to kill each other over this anymore. We'll just take what we want. Regardless of what African people thought about it, this is what European nations did, right? But in doing so, they put together people that aren't natural, don't naturally go together. There may have been historical tensions between these people. And if there weren't, the colonial powers did their best to foment tensions between the people in order to divide and conquer. So when you look at a country, we've mentioned Rwanda, and when you talk about, they want to talk about, people want to talk about genocide, these people weren't meant to be put together in the first place. You look at Nigeria, the Igbo, the Yoruba, and there's a number of other nations or people groups within the boundaries of Nigeria as we know it. That but will actually tell you no, or identify as Yoruba or Igbo before they identify as Nigerian. They would identify to Nigerian to the outside world because that's the concept that the outside world understands. But within their own boundaries, that's not how they identify. Right? So I think we're trying to make bedfellows out of people that actually don't naturally go together. I don't think our concept of nations and nation states actually works for the betterment of humanity either.
Okay.
Right? Because the way we have it designed is that a nation needs to protect their own resources.
Right.
Okay. My resources are mine. And I determine what is best for them, regardless of what might be better for everyone else. Right? So now I manage, forget about the consequences to anyone else. The other problem with that is that it leaves the gate open for exploitation. Right? And especially when you look at what's happening to Africa right now, we talk about nations and we talk about all of these things, but actually they don't actually control their own resources. Right? Western nations control their resources, but actually countries in what is known as the developing South don't. Right? And I'm not just limiting that to Africa.
No.
Right? South America. I mentioned Guatemala earlier, and the overthrow of their first democratically elected leaders. And that was all because of a US fruit company and was losing profits. So they conspired with the CIA and the US State Department. Look, that's a whole mess, right? But I don't think, as I said, it doesn't work for the betterment of humanity. We hoard our own resources. Now, in order to hoard our own resources, our own natural resources, it's not economically a wise move either. Because now, what do I have to do in order to protect my natural resources?
Well, most countries have armies and weapons.
And armies aren't cheap. The upkeep of a standing army is not cheap.
No.
So,
biggest budgets in the US go to the military. Biggest budgets in the UK go to the military. Biggest budgets in most European countries go to military.
So here's the thing. let's take the US for example. They're telling everyone, hey, you cannot have universal health care because it costs too much, but yet it costs way more to run an army
Mm.
than it does to implement universal health care.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, it's not a smart economical choice to make in regards to if we're talking about what's best for humanity and the betterment of humanity, right? I think also the other thing is one of the biggest criticisms that people throw at religion is the historical atrocities that were committed in the so-called name of religion, right? But far worse atrocities have been committed in the idea of nationhood. And there are no similar comparisons made. Like a nation can go to war and say, hey, I'm protecting myself. This is in my national interest. And that is acceptable, right? We have 2 wars in Iraq. We have numerous wars in Afghanistan. You know, you've got the U.S. in the Vietnam War. All of these things were done and said, "Hey, it's in our national interest." Then, when we start to talk about the coups and the assassinations that were carried out, all in the name of protecting national interests, surely that accounts for more deaths, more atrocities than you could ever lay at the feet of religion. So why aren't we having these conversations about the concept of nations? Why are we not talking about the atrocities committed in the name of nationhood?
Yeah.
Right. I think also you mentioned the idea of government be and a way of organization. Large governments often fail to understand the needs of small communities and of local communities.
Okay. Yeah,
right?
that's true.
So if you're trying to manage at a national level over a large area, it's not going to be possible to do so efficiently and effectively because you are not going to be addressing the needs of the local populace.
Yeah.
Right. So you need local systems of government that are able to be self-determining. So you take the UK, for example. Even if we were to take it at, and I don't mean the micro level, the real micro level of boroughs or councils, right? Let's look at it from the concept of England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. Scotland has some ability to make decisions, but then it has to go to Westminster and say, hey, can we do this? Can we do that for certain other things? So it is not able to effectively govern for its own populace. It has to go and ask someone else for permission. And if that person says no, the populace and the needs of the populace go unmet. Now, are there benefits or some benefits to having a larger system at play? Yes. But all of these things can be worked out and negotiated on a smaller basis to come together to build something.
Okay, so I mean, I'm thinking about two things really. One is the pooling of resources, which obviously has helped. You know, we have moved incredible steps forward in technology and advancements during the industrial age, and so on and so forth, through these kind of collective pooling of resources. I'm going to put aside all the atrocities done in its name for the time being, because I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole. But how does that work? Because at the moment, we have a system in which, let's say, for example, let's take even the difference between some neighboring European countries and their healthcare systems. Some are free at the point of care, some are half and half, some are just completely privatized, all kinds of different versions of a healthcare system. How do you overcome some of those challenges if you aren't pooling resources? There are specializations at certain hospitals, let's say. So for example, if you're a cancer sufferer, there are some hospitals that are in a completely different district which you're able to access because of the fact that you're part of that nation. I can go to such and such a place and access healthcare, so on and so forth. So how does that work?
I think our belief in the concept of nations also affects how we determine resources should be managed, because my resources are for me and my people.
Right, I see.
And so it actually helps underpin capitalism, because I need to maintain it for me and my people. Whereas if you were to remove the concept of nations, then it allows you not to think of solely my people, but or as determined by the boundaries that people have arbitrarily drawn up. But my people can now be thought in a more global sense.
Right. Okay. I mean, I don't know that you're ever going to, just because you get away with the idea of the nation borders gone, the way that humans are, to me, it feels like you're just going to replace a bigger border with a smaller border, because people will inevitably go, but these are my people now that live on this street. I'm now these people, and therefore you outsiders. Tends to be the arc of history, tends to go like
now,
people have this
here's the thing with that. Here's the thing with that. When you break it down into smaller sectors like that, it's actually what you say. You actually lack the resources in order to be able to be so isolationist. You need to be more cooperative to actually get that which you need.
Okay. I mean, but isn't it like the kind of block forming we see happening within, like, Europe? These are all different nations who work together cooperatively to get something done, and there aren't really real borders anymore. You can walk across the streets in most cases, and one half of the road lives in one country, other half of the road lives in another country. There's it's kind of like, it's a cooperative. That
well, firstly, one of the first things I'll say to this is, actually, when you speak to a lot of Europeans, they'll say actually life has improved because they've gotten rid of that and they've allowed the freedom of movement, right? So you have that freedom of movement and things have improved, or people feel the quality of life has improved. But here's the thing, they still have this concept of a nation.
Yeah, I guess
they still have this concept of you don't actually belong here.
Yeah,
they still have this concept of othering you.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay?
And they're still happy to go around the world and stick a flag in other people's countries and say it's theirs. Yeah, that's true.
Right. So, but the point is, just in that small concept of allowing people the freedom to move, they say life is better for them.
It's interesting. At the freedom of movement point, you can kind of sell me on, just because I think there is a false narrative around the freedom of movement. There is a narrative that, those people are coming to this place and they're going to take whatever I have, right? There's this kind of narrative that if you have freedom of movement, then those people will just flood into your country. Whereas the truth is that that's not really the case within, let's say, a place which has removed all of those kind of boundaries and has freedom of movement within the countries. You don't see floods of people going one way and another way and taking over. And what you see is there are communities that pop up in different places, but by and large, people stay in their own, where they like, whatever their climate is that they're accustomed to. People tend to stay within their climate. So there is kind of a, I guess, some evidence to suggest if you took away the borders, it's not what most people think is going to happen. And in fact, I guess you could argue that the UK putting up their border again is proof that now you have even more people trying to get in than when you didn't have a border. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. When people are free to move,
Here's the thing.
where they
I
are.
always relegate capitalism, right? But this is the one regards in which it would work, right? And by that, I mean, if the markets dictate, then the markets would dictate that actually, when there's a demand, people will move to that area.
Mm-hmm.
But in doing so, they leave one area, thus creating a demand in the area that they just left.
Mm. Mm-mm-mm. Yeah.
Right? And so if capitalism actually works, and then let the markets dictate. Remove the borders, let the markets dictate where people move to.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could say this, it goes beyond capitalism, the kind of border information, because if we look at a place like China and the issues that they were having with the island off their coast.
Taiwan,
thank you. It's an entire, it's a whole place, like it's an island. It stands apart as its own place, identity, etc. It's not on your mainland, it's somewhere separate, and yet still there is this constant threat of their borders being smashed to pieces, literally, because the bigger place wants to take over the smaller place. And for me, I'm always like, I don't understand what your desperate need is to go stick a flag in somebody else's place. You don't live there. It doesn't bother you. The people are going about their daily. Leave the people alone. If you want a resource that they have, talk to the people, buy the resource, move on. And so it's not just a capitalistic idea. It is a kind of worldwide problem that we have. That lends itself to this kind of colonialist idea, I guess, is a more accurate description of, I want what you have, so I'm just going to make you either part of me so that I can have it, and thereby put up borders to stop other people having it, whatever it is that they think that they have.
Look,
so the border issue is
I see it being built on the concept of greed. Nations are built on the concept of greed. And that's how I interpret it. And one of the other things that comes out of this is that in having such large areas of land to be governed, it makes it harder to hold leaders accountable.
So you see that in somewhere like the USA, right? It's so vast, and the people are so
not just the USA.
One area to another. But I'm saying that's an obvious answer. You know, it's such a vast country with such different, you can't go to Texas and find the same kind of people that are in California, that are in Miami, that are in New York, that are in Pennsylvania. The people are so different. And therefore governing is an entire nation made up of states like that is really difficult, right?
Yes, but
that's a critical place where you see it on the ground that they are really struggling to manage their people.
But it's even in smaller places, you know, like you take the UK, for example. UK is tiny, right? Even then, it's still hard to hold the leaders of the nation to account. You hold your government in London. I live up in the Hebrides somewhere. We all live up in the Hebrides somewhere. I want to come and make a case or a complaint or protest. How far have I actually got to travel to make a difference? Right? How far have I got to travel to have my voice heard?
Mm.
you know, and people know that by isolating your government offices from people, it makes it easier to ignore them.
Mm.
And I think it's Egypt that's tried this a couple of times, and I think they're finally doing it now. But they tried to move the the government offices, so they're building another city out in the desert. It's been tried once or twice before. Now they finally built a city out in the desert, and they're moving the government offices away because when there's been protests historically and revolutions, the government offices were too easy for the people to get to and congregate at. So now they're moving them far out into the desert. They built a city out in the desert. So now when the people get upset, you can't get to the government offices so easily. And that's simply
Disturbing.
based on the fact that the larger the area, the
Okay.
harder it becomes to hold the leadership to account.
Okay. So then you have these ideas that then become pervasive of if we take, you can potluck any country at this point and take any issue like healthcare or prison systems or blah blah blah. So how then, yeah, so here's another one. So I know that we're going to go over time a little bit more for the questions, but okay, so you have these kinds of issues about governing people, but how do you then enforce things like law? I mean, nobody wants to live in a place which is lawless, where people just murder because they're vexed or they steal and there's no judicial system that protects it. Every country has some form of judicial system in place to keep the people safe. Whether everything has checks and balances. Some things work better than others, but in principle, everywhere has some sort of law and order. Is that something that you see as a positive to having nations, that you do get to have this structural law and order system? And there are obvious flaws to the systems. Of course, there are some systems that work better than others. I'm not arguing the systems necessarily, but that there is a structural system of law and order to protect people.
There is a structural system, but there's no universal system.
No, but I mean, if you live in a
So then
nation,
what difference does it make?
I've got the rights and protections. If I'm in this nation, whatever nation I arrive in,
Mhm,
I have the rights and protections afforded to me of that nation. But if there is
mhm.
no nation, how do you then have a law and order system? How do you have the rights, protections that we do enjoy? Let's be honest. We
Mhm.
don't live in the Wild West. We're not living in places. Lots of Western people are not living in places, I should quantify that, in which those laws are there aren't proper systems of governance.
Really?
And that people,
Did you not see the Black Lives Matter protests going on for a number of years?
no, I understand. I'm not arguing about whether systems can be improved or whether they're flawed or what have you. That's not my point to argue right now, because that's a different point than the point I'm trying to bring across, which is that whether I wholeheartedly get behind the system or whether it needs to be overhauled or what have you, let's all be honest that most of us, maybe outside of America, live in places in which, especially if you're watching this, a lot of our viewers come from places in which they benefit from having a legal framework within their country, a law, some sort of law and order
Right.
system. They can walk down their roads. It's not every man for themselves. They can go about their business and get gainful employment and do what they have to and come home. And if
Right.
a crime is committed, that it is a crime and that there is a judicial process that they can appeal to have that
Mhm.
crime held to
Right.
account.
And I don't see how that operates any differently from what we have, or would have to operate any differently from what we have existing in large today. I don't think there's a society on earth that really says, "Hey, no, go ahead and kill who you like." I don't think there's a society on earth that says, "Hey, it's okay, go take your neighbor's stuff. Nobody really cares." These are common principles that pretty much run through every society I can think of. Um,
Yes, but
and
those
even
principles
more
are
so,
grounded.
what's that?
I mean, but those principles over time have become more embedded to the fact that we aren't now living in places where, or for the most part, I haven't lived in places in which those rules are not kept. Most people know them and keep them, and partly that's due to the fact that there are penalties for that. Because if you think
But what makes you
two,
think that?
300 years ago, 4, 5, 1,000 years ago, we were in a different place where things worked slightly differently, and people behaved slightly
But what
differently.
makes you think? What makes you think people wouldn't impose penalties within their own communities and local communities for committing such crimes?
I'm just asking how it would work because, as I say, at the moment we have, let's take for example a
I
European
think
country.
it works exactly the way it does today, just on a smaller scale, on a more local scale.
Wouldn't you need like national cooperation though? Because there is corruption, right? So,
Right.
for example, if let's say in a European country, let's say
But you're
Belgium.
talking about national cooperation.
No,
There
but
is no national.
hear me out when I say this. So my point being, we at the moment we have kind of levels of governance, right? So
Mhm,
you would be seen at your first level of court for a criminal offense.
mhm,
Should you feel that that trial went unfair, let's say in Belgium, you would go to your high court. Should the high court, you could go to the Supreme Court. Once the Supreme Court rules and you still feel it's unfair, you could go to the European courts and the courts of human rights. So you have these kind of levels that we benefit
mhm.
from having a nationalized system in which a local judge will say something that will be then checked by a national judge, which will then be checked by a kind of an international, in this case, a European judge. And therefore, should all things being equal and the system work properly, you have all of these levels of appeal that you can go to, that you can get your case heard before. Whereas if it's just me, my people, what if the judge has been paid off? What happens then? Where am I going? Who do I get to appeal to?
What, like judges don't get paid off now?
Yeah, people do get paid off now. I'm not saying they don't,
So,
but there is
so,
there is
so,
some.
so the point is, look, the point is, you can still establish those systems on a smaller level. You could establish for a criminal case a tribunal. So for matters of that, there'd be a tribunal process and a jury process. And
Wouldn't you
as
need
a
like more cooperation though to have these kind of
yes,
checks?
absolutely. Absolutely, you need
Like
more
in the end, a
cooperation.
nation is like more
Hmm?
cooperation. Isn't that in the end what a nation is? More cooperation.
No. I, I want to know, right? Okay, so you say a
Oh,
nation is the concept of more cooperation. If a nation is based on the concept of more cooperation, then why do I need borders?
yeah, okay. Because the other people haven't agreed to cooperate with you. Shouldn't they agree to cooperate as well?
Yes,
Like in
but
in some countries, this is true. Like in the UK, you have
mhm,
four nations plus islands and other bits and pieces that all make up the UK, right?
mhm.
But they're all individual countries. They're all individual places. They all have their
Imagine
individual.
that to Scotland, who wants to break away and being told they can't hold a referendum on it.
Listen, they're having some real challenges there. I appreciate that point, I really do. But my point being that the principle that Scotland is arguing is that it's a free uh, cooperation. And that's actually their point. The point that they're arguing in law is that
Mhm,
it's a free cooperation. And if we're not free to leave, then it can't be that we're free to stay. And therefore, you're breaking your own agreement by saying, no, we can't have a vote as to whether we leave or we stay. That's breaking the idea that we are a free cooperation. But the principle that it was supposed to be is that it's some kind of cooperation. The European Union, lots of little, because I mean, let's be honest, Europe is smaller,
mhm,
lots of little places
mhm,
that make up one bigger place that are cooperating, within which inside there's no borders. But on the outside, they haven't agreed to cooperate with the inside yet.
mhm.
So we can't have no borders with you because you guys haven't agreed to cooperate.
Yeah. Absolutely. But we have borders now and people still aren't cooperating. Just ask Putin.
Oh dear. Well,
Look,
I
I
don't know
know.
where.
Listen. I know it seems like an idealistic position to hold,
Okay.
and I don't have all the answers for all the micro details worked out. Right?
Hmm.
Look, this is for minds greater than mine. Right? But the reality is, I don't see how nations are actually helping to improve or solve any of the world's problems. And
Okay.
too many resources are being spent to defend this concept of nations at the expense of people.
Okay. That we
And for
can agree
me,
on.
it should always be people first.
Fair enough. Agreed. 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 Okay. I think we can agree on that. That's probably a nice note to end on, that we actually agree this week that it should be people first. And I definitely agree with you that it should be people first. Maybe our viewers will be really happy that we agree this week that it should be people first.
Look, and I know there's going to be a lot of people that are going to struggle with this concept because you grew up on the idea of a nation, or, you know, here's the reality. From my personal experience, my sense of belonging does not come out of the fact that I hold a passport.
No.
You can hold a passport to a country and still not feel at home there. You might be used to it. It might be familiar to you, but you never feel at home there. You don't feel safe there. You don't feel secure there. You don't feel accepted there. You don't feel wanted there. And so your sense of identity and community and belonging should come from something else. But as long as we hold on to this concept of nations and things like this, then actually it becomes harder for people to find that sense of identity and belonging, because you're already determined for what your place in life from birth.
Right.
And let's be honest. If you take it to someone from the diaspora, you don't feel at home and you don't feel welcome when you're born into a white country that doesn't want you, doesn't accept you, and asks you constantly, where are you from? Then how do you achieve that sense of identity and belonging if, as nations are set up, you don't have the freedom? Say I felt Ghanaian and I found a community there and I was accepted by that community there, and I, you know, adopted cultures and practices of the peoples that were there, and whichever people it is within Ghana, or what we know as Ghana. As the system is set up, I couldn't just go and become part of that community.
No, you have to apply.
Apply, and even then it could be turned down. That's the whole point. I have to ask you for permission. Now, I'm not asking the community that I'm trying to become a part of, who may have welcomed me with open arms and said, "Hey, we'd love to have you with us in this community." I'm not asking them for permission. I'm asking someone who doesn't know these people and who doesn't know me to make a decision on this. And that to me just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm necessarily against what you're saying. I remember the first conversation we had in which it really kind of made me go, what now? I'm sorry. We obviously need people to protect us. We obviously, we need judicial systems. Obviously, our resources are shared. Obviously, I benefit from the fact that I am from a country. I identify with a group of people. I don't necessarily identify with the same people that hold my passport as I identify with other people, but I recognize that I've benefited from education, access to healthcare, access to policing and judicial systems and other things. No?
I just want to point out this concept of, because you come from a place having access to education, education could still be free. And I'll give you an example of this. So Cuba educates medical professionals that are accepted from anywhere
Okay.
in the world for free.
Oh,
So like they have a massive, it's one of the largest medical schools in the world, right?
okay.
If you're accepted into that medical care in Cuba, your tuition is free,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when there are ecological disasters or anything of this nature around the world, Cuba sends out doctors. So during the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
when Italy was being overwhelmed, they sent 500 doctors to Italy to help the Italian care system so it wouldn't buckle, right?
Okay.
They have hundreds of Palestinians that they're educating for free to return to Palestine and become doctors there because they believe medical care should be a human right. So just because you come from a nation doesn't preclude, or just because you come from a certain area doesn't preclude you from moving to another area and being educated for free.
Okay. Okay. Something I think all of our viewers will have to ponder, I guess, as we think of our identities, as we think of the things that we've come to believe about the passports we hold, about the places we live in, about the systems of governance that we have. Um, and I'm not sure that we can do much about it, but it certainly is food for thought for those of us who are having these conversations about how we improve the systems that we have in our society to make it more accessible, to make it better. I don't think we can get rid of nations at this point. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if
No, listen,
we
as
all
I
watch
said,
the dark side, maybe if they all came over
listen,
to the dark side.
I
Cha-ching!
said it was an idealistic position to hold. But here's a thought for you and anybody who's watching this as a Christian. Is this not what we ultimately believe in the end anyway?
Oh, well, you see, and that is how I remember the last conversation ending and me just walking away going, oh, well, you know what? Okay, conversation done. Yes, that's true. Ultimately, we believe that all of this will be done away with. Yes, indeed. Amen. 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 Ideas of nations and things that divide us will be done away with. Praise God. Praise God. Well, on that note, I think we should say goodbye to the people unless you have another last point you want to make for them.
No, sir, I'm good.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on the dark side. We really do enjoy. We only have, I believe it's 2 more before we break. Is it even 2 more? Let's have a look. Yes, potentially 2 more before we break for our Christmas break. So we only have 2 more weeks. So if you have a topic that you would like us to cover, please do send it along. I know a few of you contacted to make sure that we were going to cover the cases that we mentioned, the news stories we mentioned earlier, and we did cover them for you. So I hope that you enjoyed those discussions. For those of you that disagree, please add that to the comment section. We are always happy to have the conversation next time. Send along any information. And if I forget, which I might, it is true, please do just put it in the comments and remind me that I need to go back to that news story, because I will have it in my stuff. I just may not remember to say it out loud at that point. So thank you for everyone who joins. Please share, like, do the thing, subscribe to the channel, make sure that you get regular updates on when the dark side is available. Hey, Mr. Storm.
Yeah, look, I'm just like anybody who's struggling and wants to defend nations, bring it. I don't care.
Indeed. And as you can tell from our winter attire, it is cold where we are, but the gas prices are high. Pray for the people. All right. Bless you. Peace out. We're praying for you all this as we enter into the winter season. Good night.